Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
I am
Hey.
changing my name and I can't spell facilitator. There we go.
Nice. Okay. Have we decided who's doing the intro, who's doing the questions and everything?
I guess I wrote the intro so I can do that.
Okay, cool.
Nice. Thanks.
I can pick the questions from the chat and send them.
And she'll let us know when we're live. How are you authors doing?
We are great.
Good.
So excited to be here. Thank you so much for all the work y'all have been doing to put this together.
Well, we're so glad to have you guys.
Even
How has the touring circuit been?
virtual?
Virtual,
yeah. Lots of Zoom meetings and tours and panels, but all good stuff.
Yeah. You really feel the energy, you know, even through the screen. Like, I think when people are excited to be there, you can feel that, and that really helps.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. It's interesting because it feels like everyone is really missing being in real life. But if you stop for a minute and kind of think about it, there are also a lot of benefits that have happened and a lot of access we wouldn't have had otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I feel like we have about as many people like in right now, but people can probably be joining as we go. But I'm just going to start the introduction. Is that good?
Yeah, that's totally fine by me. I'm not sure if Lauren is going to tell us when we go live.
I think she already said in the chat that we are
Oh,
live.
perfect. Yeah. Excellent.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome back, or welcome to the 2021 Greater Rochester Teen Book Festival. I'm Marcella Sincata. My pronouns are she and her. And this panel is called Unlikely Heroes. Before I introduce everybody, and they can introduce themselves as well, here's just a few reminders. If you have any question for the authors, please remind us in either the Zoom chat, and I'm also aware some people are putting them in the feed loop chat. Also, please remain muted for this whole session, and it's also being recorded so that it can live on after this, so just be aware of that. Okay, I think many of us would agree that unlikely heroes are just like the best kind of heroes. Whether it was foretold by an ancient prophecy or by a magical weapon, or prompted by struggles we all could realistically face, it's clear that we love unlikely heroes because they help us believe that, at a moment's notice, we could be heroes in our own right. And now for the heroes of this panel is our authors. So we have Morgan Baden, who has ghostwritten many bestsellers, as well as co-writing The Hive with her husband, Barry Liga. Rena Barron is author of Kingdom of Soul series, as well as Maya and the Rising Dark series. And finally, Claire Legrand, who's author of the Imperium trilogy, Saul Kill Girls, and a lot of other titles. Thank you guys for being here. And we can move on to some questions, and I'm going to hand it off to our panel facilitator, Kenya.
Hi, thanks so much for being with us today. And to the audience for being here. I'm so glad that we've been able to have this festival this year in spite of all these things that we've experienced. So we do have a few questions sort of in the can and that we'll start with, but as teens and even adults in the audience have questions, Laura will jump in and ask some of those questions. So we'll try and prioritize the questions from the chat. So my first question for each one of you is, where do you think your idea of what a hero is comes from? Or how would you define a hero? Who wants to start?
You're starting with the loaded question.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
You thought I was going to give you a softball? No, we don't do that here.
I could take a stab at this. I think this ideal of hero, what a hero is, comes from a lot of the stories that we've consumed growing up and throughout our lives, whether that be through books or TV or film. We also see it in our real lives. Like we talk about certain people in certain jobs are heroes, like a doctor can be a hero, or firefighter can be a hero, or someone who's doing something that feels very selfless. And so my ideal, and what I kind of went for with my Kingdom of Soul series, is that you have a character, her name is Ara, who does these kind of selfless acts to protect her family and her kingdom, protect these little orphan kids, actually, in the very beginning, why she makes her initial sacrifice. And so I think that is so prevalent in our culture, this ideal that a hero is going to be the one who stands up against wrong, against evil, who's going to put themselves on the line, even when it's not so easy, when it's scary, when it's dangerous. They're going to, even if they're just like, oh my God, this is horrible, but I'm going to be the one to stand up. I think there's something very honorable about that, and something that's very like you can admire it, because you're like, wow, when we're all scared, here's someone who's putting aside their fear and facing the impossible. Even if they're not magical or they don't have any special powers, but they're still like going out there and putting themselves forward to say, like, I'm going to be the one that stands up. And I think there's something that's really endearing about that.
I absolutely agree. That's a great way to put it. Heroes to me, yes, my idea of a hero has been formed by all the media I consumed growing up, the people I see around me, things in the news, things on the TV. But something that I sort of use as a touchstone to guide me when I'm creating the heroes of my stories, there are two things. One, the heroes I love reading about are heroes who, kind of like what Rena was saying, they are afraid, but they go forward even so. And I also like writing heroes that are honest about their fear, and they express it and they talk about it, and maybe they're ashamed by it a little bit, but they learn to accept that fear and they move through it. And then I also like writing heroes, again, as Rena said, a hero doesn't have to have magical powers or be a super strong warrior or be very talented or be super smart. In my book, Thornlight, which just came out, the hero of the story is a girl who doesn't have any magical powers. She is kind of a sensitive introvert, and she keeps to herself, and she has a humble job, and she likes to make art with trash she finds in the street. But she's a gentle soul, and she is very tenderhearted, and she's compassionate, and she has so much capacity for love. And those things become basically her arsenal of weapons. And her heroism comes from her ability to stay gentle and compassionate and brave, even in the face of things that are horrifying, and even when other people aren't showing her the same kind of compassion. So I think it's so interesting to explore different kinds of heroes, to take what we grew up on and then subvert that in various ways.
I love both of those answers. I'm still stuck on defining hero, and I'm over here like, I don't know. But I will say, yes, I mean, certainly things like, the superheroes we've all grown up with, the real life medical and first responder heroes, those kinds of things are all true. I think it wasn't until recently that I started to realize too, that a hero can be someone who is not necessarily saving the world from a disaster, but maybe it's just day by day making the world a little bit better in very concrete ways. I have 2 little kids, and my 6-year-old is obsessed with the Rebel Girls series, which is like my favorite books to read. And I learn something every time we read another one of those chapters. And I think I love them because it really drives home the idea that A, there are real world heroes among us, and B, they're doing things that sometimes are monumental in changing the world and sometimes are just incremental, and both matter. And so, I think the other thing too is that heroes can be deeply flawed. And in fact, they should be, because we all are. And so when I think about writing a hero, I'm going to take a page from Claire's book and show the cover of The Hive. But Cassie is the hero of this book. And honestly, Cassie's not a great teenager. She's very angry. She's grieving. She lashes out because of that grief. She's wrong a lot. And I think that's really important for readers to see too, is that the hero can be wrong, they can be flawed, but they are ultimately working towards some kind of vision that helps make the world, slightly better, or their world slightly better.
Yeah, I think that's important, especially for young readers, to see that you can be messy and flawed and make mistakes, but you can still do things to help others and change the world and move the things around you in a positive direction, even if it's really messy while you're doing it.
Those are great answers. It sounds like this piece about their being human, but also part of this larger humanity really strikes me as you guys are talking. I wish I could live tweet this, but I feel like as facilitator, I have to be paying more attention to you. Lots of great quotes that you guys are saying that I'll have to go back and tweet later. So I have another question that is kind of related to that, to stick with that. Do you think that you set out to write heroes? Do you think that your characters are heroes as you're writing them?
Some of my heroes are not at all heroic, many times. So the first book in the Imperium trilogy, Furyborn, there are two heroes, two protagonists, Riel and Eliana, and I set out to make them the main characters, but I didn't say, oh, these are going to be heroes. Sometimes they do heroic things, sometimes they do very not heroic things. But my main goal is not necessarily to write a hero, but to write somebody who people can relate to in various ways, somebody who has an interesting, complicated story, somebody who shows growth, sometimes positive growth, sometimes negative growth, but they are still like a fully realized person. They are the hero of their own story, whether they're doing it right or not. So it's not that I set out to write a hero. I set out to write, because that's what I do, complicated female protagonists. That's what I focus on. And if they turn out to be heroic, great. If sometimes they turn out to be not heroic, well, that makes for an interesting story. And it makes readers think about, wow, would I have done that thing that they did? Or would I have done the other thing? Would I have been the hero in that moment, or would I not have, and why? And those kinds of messy questions help readers reflect on themselves and on the people around them. And that can be really rich and worthwhile.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And something that Claire is bringing up about whether you set out to write a hero, and it makes me think, does your character think they're a hero when you're writing it? And that's actually an interesting distinction, because if your character has it in their head that they're a hero versus they're just living their lives and trying to survive and trying to do what's best and what's right, there has to be a completely different perspective of how they kind of walk through this world and go through their stories. And I would say as well, I definitely don't set out to write heroes. I just want to write complex stories about these characters living their lives and how they're dealing with sometimes impossible situations. So with my Kingdom of Soul series, the character, Ara, she's born in this world that there is magic, but she doesn't have magic. So she's already kind of the unlikely hero of the story. And she does some really big sacrifices to get the magic she's needing to kind of help solve a bad thing that's going on and figure out what's happening. She doesn't see herself as a hero. She just sees herself as, I need to protect my family, my friends. I need to understand why this bad thing is happening. And she makes a lot of mistakes, and she has a lot of assumptions that are not right. And she does some things that she believes in her heart and with all her heart that it's the right choice, but it's not necessarily the right choice. And it kind of digs her a little bit deeper and deeper and deeper until she's in this situation where it's like, oh gosh, this is not good. And I think that people can relate to that. And I think it's that when we talk about that humanity in our main characters, that make people understand, like, a hero is not someone who's perfect. Like, I don't know, I personally don't want to read perfect people because they don't exist in real life. And so readers know that. And I think readers can gravitate to stories where they're flawed characters because, the writers are flawed, readers are flawed. So we understand that, so we can relate to it. my middle grade, Maya and the Rising Dark. So Maya, she's this girl who grows up on the south side of Chicago. She kind of has this really regular life, and she finds out like her father is this guardian between our world and the mysterious dark world. And then he goes missing, and she has to like kind of go into overdrive to save him. But she has no magical powers in the beginning of the story. She's just like, I got my staff and I'm going to go fight the bad guys. I'm going to figure out what's going on. And she makes all these, like, she's 12 years old. She makes a lot of rash decisions, not always right. And she kind of just goes kind of headlong into, trying to do what she thinks best to find her father and then protect her community from these monsters that are attacking. And I think that, a lot of people can relate to that. So ultimately, it's not even this ideal of a hero that I think people are relating to. It's just this human quality of, we all can relate to wanting the best for our friends or family and ourselves, and wanting the best for the world. And sometimes it is doing it in little small ways, and sometimes it is in grand ways as well.
And then I would say too, on the flip side, I write the Daphne and Velma trilogy, which is a YA reboot of Scooby-Doo starring Daphne and Velma. And that was a whole different animal, of course, because they are already considered part of the heroes of Scooby-Doo, right? So those characters are all the main characters, solving problems, solving mysteries. And so going into writing those was very different than writing a separate book where you've got this deeply flawed character and she doesn't know she's about to go on this life-changing journey and whatnot. With Daphne and Velma, like, I knew they were going on a journey. I knew they were the stars of the show. And I knew I still had to make them interesting and compelling enough for the reader so that a reader doesn't open the book and think, well, I know what happens in a Scooby-Doo episode, right? Like, they solve the crime, they solve the mystery, done. So it was a really different mind frame writing that one when it came to making Daphne and Velma the hero characters, because I had to build in a lot of stumbles for them. And a lot of, just a lot of interesting angles while staying true to who they are classically and who everyone already knows they are. So it's so interesting. And I just think that writing about heroes, whether they're likely or unlikely, is part of what makes this job so fun, because there's so many different ways you can do it.
So here's a question that kind of ties into that. Do you guys think every story has a hero?
I'm trying to think of a story that doesn't. Because my immediate inclination was to say yes, whether it's a unlikely or likely or likable or unlikable, or an anti-hero, right? There's got to be someone who's driving the action forward.
So it sounds then for you, the word hero and protagonist mean the same thing?
Oh, that's a great question. Mostly, yeah, I guess I'm using them slightly interchangeably. But also, an anti-hero is deeply fascinating to me as well. And in a way, I guess I don't know, I was going to say kind of similar to an unlikely hero, but not really. But I don't know. I'm still landing on, I think every story has a hero.
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about when we were defining what is a hero. I mean, if we just don't have kind of this one stereotypical view of what defines a hero, and we talk about, it could be the really small things. It's like, I rescued a cat from trapped in a tree. Okay, you're a hero. You really are. But I mean, it is really the definition of what that means. I survived another day. I survived abuse. I just, anything like that makes a person a hero in their own way. So I think if we don't have such a narrow view of this definition of hero, if we're thinking Superman, hero, and everyone else not, then no, every story doesn't. But if we broaden our horizon and how we think about what a hero is and that centering of them in the story, I think, yes, every story does have a hero in its own way.
I agree. And I think probably most stories have multiple heroes. You have your protagonist and the action revolves around them and they are moving the story forward. But there are lots of other people moving the story forward and people around them that they notice doing everyday extraordinary things that they admire. You know, a protagonist could look at their mom and say, wow, look, she's working so hard to put food on our table. She's a hero. This person that maybe the protagonist doesn't step in to stop a bully at school, but notices someone else doing it. And so they're not being heroic, but they recognize heroism and see it in others. I think it's kind of like I don't know. It's also interesting to think about even antagonists probably think of themselves as the hero of their own story. And in fact, I think the best antagonists do. They have a mission, they have their own set of values. They think that what they are doing, not every villain, not every antagonist, but many antagonists think that what they are doing is for a purpose. It is the right thing to do. It is for a reason. And that's really interesting because it could make your protagonist think, well, they think they're a hero, but so what does that make me? And it can make characters and readers think and reflect upon the definition of a hero. So it's just, this is a really fascinating conversation because it's making me think about this definition of hero and what that means. It means something different to everybody. And it can take so many different forms. Yeah, so these are really great questions. And
Claire, you know, I really love the anti-hero ideal, and this ideal that the antagonist has its own kind of story, his own story and vision and reason. And that's the fun part of writing for me, especially because you're like, if you do it right, then your readers are like, I can kind of see their side of it too. I can see why they're doing this thing. I may not agree with their choices and how they're going about it, but I can see their reasoning. And that's all we really want from any of these characters, whether they're hero or villain or whatever, is we want you to be able to relate a little bit to what they're doing.
I think that, oh, go ahead, Morgan.
I was just going to say it's about adding that empathy even to the villain, especially to the hero, but also to the villain. And you're right, to make the reader have a moment of wondering, wait a minute, who is the good guy here? And who is the bad guy? What if the bad guy is actually the good guy? And, you know, I always think of Thanos is for the superhero fans, like Thanos thinks he's the good guy, you know, and building that empathy around him can be done. And that's the fascinating part of it.
Yeah,
and I think those are the new movies, right? Like the Maleficent movie, the Cruella movie, the Hook movie. And you know, Thanos wasn't entirely wrong about everything.
Right. He had some good points there.
Absolutely. Laura, any other questions from the chat?
Yeah, so how do you find unlikely coincides at all with unlikable? Or how do you guys define unlikely? Or, unlikely.
I think a protagonist can be unlikely and unlikable, but that's not a necessity. I love writing unlikable heroes. And that word is kind of loaded and people can have lots of passionate feelings about what unlikable means. To me, unlikable is often just another way of saying, well, they're really complicated and messy and they're not always easy to read about because you want to root for them, but you can't always because they make bad choices, or you understand where they're coming from, but wow, they're really obnoxious about certain things. And, you know, but that's true to life. You know, we love people, but they make horrible decisions or they annoy us in certain ways. Or we don't like somebody and then we see them doing something wonderful and realize that, oh, actually people are very messy, and reading characters that are unlikable and are so complicated in those ways, I think can help us challenge our assumptions about other people in the world and what it means to be, as Morgan was saying, the bad guy or the good guy. What does that even mean? Like, who gets to decide what bad and good is? And I think unlikable heroes sort of challenge those preconceived notions that many of us have. Like in Furyborn, the two protagonists are, you know, if you want to call them this, I don't really, but if you want to call them unlikable, they make bad decisions. They're sometimes very selfish. They sometimes you know, they go for the rash, violent solution as opposed to something more well-reasoned. And sometimes they know that they're doing wrong and they just don't care. But I think that's really fascinating just from a purely storytelling standpoint. Those are the people I want to read about. Because again, as we've all sort of been saying, those people reflect real life, reflect humanity. And it inspires, I think, readers to reflect upon themselves and reflect upon the world around them in really interesting ways.
I really love this ideal of, and I've been fascinated about people talking about unlikable characters, because I think a little bit of it that we always miss as readers is that these unlikable characters, so to speak, it's a lot around discomfort. That's what we're really feeling when we read these characters and we say, oh, this person's so unlikable. So what is it? What is this characterization, or what is this thing that they're doing? They're obnoxious, they're liars, they're cheaters, whatever. Or maybe it's not even that, they're whining too much. Why? I think it becomes, why do we have such a visceral reaction to some of the characterization, and to understand kind of how that's reflected maybe in ourselves or people around us, in the reality of things. Because are we trying to pretend that people aren't like this? Because then that's not realistic. And I think that's why it's always funny, because I don't read reviews personally for myself, but I read reviews of other books. And it's always interesting and fascinating to me, the things that other people will find very unlikable about a character. And I would think like, no, that's at least realistic. This is a fully realized character who's complex and is messy and has all these things happening. And to not forget that. We want to see that, because that's a reflection of real life. So it's always interesting to just see people talk about it and not realize that sometimes when we're saying unlikable characters, what we're really saying is that we're expressing our own biases and sometimes our own prejudices. And having to analyze that in ourselves can be very difficult.
Yeah, I'm nodding over here at both of those comments. When I think of someone either in real life or in fiction who is tagged as unlikable, to me that means either they have some inner work to do on themselves, or society has sort of tagged them as unlikable for various systemic reasons. And both of those make me want to go along on a journey with them to figure out who they really are underneath. I would say too, like, find me a single person who is likable more than, I don't know, like likable 99% of the time. I don't think that exists, right? Even my amazing kids are not likable 100% of the time. So I always, like, that's where the interest is for me, is, well, what makes them tick, right? What makes them unlikable? Well, if they are too sarcastic or mean, or they're bullies or whatever, like, well, what's underneath that? Okay, well, what's underneath that layer? Now take me deeper. Like, I just want to keep going deeper until we actually get to the core of a character or a person. And for me, that usually starts with someone being unlikable. I think a lot about, I think Courtney Summers writes really outstanding unlikable characters in her YA. And so I always think of unlikable, by the way, I love them, but I think they're intended to be tough to manage and tough to read. And that kind of grittiness is what always compels me as a reader. And frankly, as a person too.
Yeah, so I know that Laura has another question, but it's interesting to me to kind of like the protagonist hero thing, because it sounds like in some of the conversation we're having, unlikable and unrelatable are being used interchangeably, which I don't think of as the same thing. But also, like, I'm also trying to think of people in real life that I don't like, and there are some, so like, like there are actually some people who, for me, are unlikable, and that could be religion, it could be politics, it could be they suck their teeth a lot, but I think there's this visceral reaction to say, I don't like that person, when that really does happen sometimes.
Well, when I think of unrelatable, I think of a billionaire with 3 yachts, and I can't relate to that person because I don't have a yacht. That's what I think of the difference.
And sometimes that's fun to read about, somebody whose experience is just completely different from your own. I think what it comes down to when you're creating something, when you're writing a story, write as many unlikable characters as you want. All of my characters, I feel like, are unlikable in different ways. But the key, I think, is to keep your audience interested. And there has to be something that's understandable or relatable or just flat out entertaining about characters, so that readers will keep reading even when they roll their eyes. Oh, here she goes again, this character, like making bad decisions, but they still want to keep reading.
Yeah, there's got to be a spark of something besides unlikability that keeps the reader hanging on to find more.
If it's a lot of unlikable characters, it needs to be a likable story, maybe. Or
yeah. And if this person is going to be super sarcastic all the time, well, you got to balance that out with something like maybe they have a secret soft spot for their little sister or whatever, so they're just, again, showing all the complicated layers of people.
Those are great points. Thanks so much. Laura?
How would you guys deal with a character that does something unforgivable? Would you still be able to call them a hero at some point?
That's an
I
interesting
think it
question.
comes back again to who defines unforgivable.
Yeah.
Something I might think is unforgivable, someone else might think is actually not, or can be worked through, and is ultimately forgivable. So that's a hard question.
Well, think about it from your, because there's, 7 billion people or however many people, we all have a different answer, but can you call a character a hero for yourself if they've done something unforgivable as you define it?
It's interesting. This is all making me reflect on the use of hero, and if I even think of any of my characters as heroes in the conventional sense. I think of them as protagonists. I think of them as sometimes having heroic moments, but they, especially in the Imperium trilogy, there are characters who do some pretty unforgivable things. They make really bad decisions. They hurt a lot of people. And I don't necessarily expect the reader to forgive them. But I think exploring that in itself is interesting, right? Like, how do you process your feelings surrounding somebody who has done something that you think is unforgivable? How do the people around this person, how do their relationships change? And does this person then learn from the unforgivable thing they've done, or do they stay the same? And those are all really interesting things to explore. Like, I love characters and stories and movies that do very unforgivable things, but I still kind of, I like them. I'm interested in them. Like, I think we can all, like, a pretty extreme example is the Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. The Joker is like terrible and does unforgivable things, but he's really compelling to watch. And I think sometimes reflecting on and examining characters who do unforgivable things helps us reflect on and examine ourselves. And that's what makes it so compelling. What is the line that we are not willing to cross, and how does it differ from the characters we're reading about? So I think going to the unforgivable place with certain characters is, again, if the story demands it, fine, go there. But I think it's also important to not expect all of your readers to forgive the character. It's just interesting ideas to explore.
And I don't even think it is that we want our readers to forgive the character who's done something unforgivable, in whatever definition that means. It's not our place to say. I think it's our place to present the character in their fully realized way in the things that they've done. And if after what they've done, there are other things that are happening that has them on this redemption track, then the reader determines whether they feel like, okay, well, this person is thoroughly redeemed or they're not. And that's going to be personal to every single reader. There are going to be readers who say like, okay, I see this person's change. And some readers can be like, nope, they did this thing and it's horrible. And I get that. And all of those are valid reactions to the characters and to what they've done. I think one thing that readers could do better. Maybe sometimes to stop thinking that maybe the author believes some of the things that the characters do, because we're very, very separate from our characters. And we're writing, you know, Claire said earlier, we're writing from all these different experiences and these different ways of thinking. So all these characters are going to have very different ways of reacting and dealing with things, and are sometimes going to do really awful things. And that doesn't really kind of reflect the writer. It just reflects that the human nature, and that people do this in real life. And then when I think about, like, you know, if someone's, you know, able to be forgiven, I also always go back to real life. Like when people do things to us in real life, or when bad things happen, it's kind of the similar reaction. Are you able to forgive or move forward? Or are you kind of going to hold that grudge? And everyone's going to be different with how they react to that. I think in a sense in the book it's easier because it's just fiction. So, so none of it really happened. We can be offended, but thank goodness some of the horrible things that we write about, especially in the fantasy space, maybe, are really real. And to keep that perspective as well.
Yeah, it's funny. Sorry to cut you off, Morgan. I think we're going to have to come to our last question. But what's coming up for me as Rena's talking is the conversations I've had with people about Snape and whether or not he was redeemed. You know, everybody nods, everybody understands that reference, right? We all have these conversations about redemption with our potentially unlikely heroes.
And just really quick before we go into the next question, I think that is the sign of a good story, right? Like when you can have these conversations and these widely varying reactions, and you can really dig deep and examine all kinds of questions like that. That's the kind of story that I aspire to write, and that's the kind of story I love to read.
And final question, Laura, what do you got for us?
Oh, do you guys relate to your characters at all in order to write them?
Can we add to that one? The relate to them, and do you base any of your heroines or heroes on people you know or yourself? And that will be our last question for everyone to have a chance to answer.
I think there are elements of reality in everything I write, and in every character I write, but not in any discernible way. Like I've never experienced someone reading a book and being like, I think that's me, because it's not, you know? So, but I certainly think there are elements either at a personality level or at an event level. So like there's something I wrote once that was a take on something that really happened, but I changed it up to fit the story. And it's funny because whenever I come across that passage, I still think of the person that inspired it, even though it was like 30 years ago. And it's different enough that no one else would ever make that connection, right? But I also think coming from myself as the author too, like, no, I forgot who said it earlier, but no, our main characters are not us. They are very separate. The voices that we give our characters are not things we necessarily believe. And that's where that's where the interest lies, right? Is figuring out how or why someone believes something that might be completely at odds to what I believe as an author. But I think for certain, I mostly write contemporary. But I think any genre, including fantasy, there are elements of reality in there, of course, of real people and of the real ways we interact with each other, the real problems we face, but just with a cool, layer on top. And sometimes that layer is really deep, and sometimes it's just a thin crust. Are we all thinking about pizza now? Because I said,
yeah, kind of. A little bit.
It's lunchtime. You bring a pizza. Come on. I would agree with that. There are none of my characters that reflect me or the people in my life exactly. But again, we talked about characters. If you're building them well, they're very complex and there are layers. So there could be a tiny little personality speck you take from someone here, someone there, you mesh it all together and you've got a new person that you can write about in the book. So that's what I tend to do. But there are some kind of fun things, like with the Maya and the Rising Dark series. Maya and her 3 friends all have like these things that they really enjoy, and all of them are from like my own childhood. So Maya's into comic books and she's into superheroes. Her friend Frankie's into like science, and her other friend Eli's into like ghost stories and paranormal. I was into all of that. So that's exactly what I'm saying. Sometimes you can take little pieces from a very high level and put them on your characters, and that's kind of fun to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't really have anything profound to add to either of those comments because they were great. But for me, it varies from book to book. You know, Some Kind of Happiness, my middle grade story about mental illness, is very directly drawn from my experiences as a kid and my own challenges. But then, you know, obviously in the fantasy space, as I think Morgan said earlier, you know, I've never actually had like supernatural powers, but there are pieces of me and all of my characters. And just from a sort of a purely selfish perspective, as a writer, it's really fun to sort of work through your own inner demons and questions about yourself and do that through your characters. And I feel like I do that to varying degrees with all of my books. Whatever I'm going through at the time kind of colors the experience of writing that book. And so in that way, I think it's just kind of unavoidable that some of you makes it into the book, even though, as everyone has said, our characters are not us. The story is not what the characters do, is not necessarily what we believe, but there is that bit of us, I think, that touches everything we write.
All right, we have 4 minutes left. Are there any final thoughts or plugs that you wanted to make sure you got a chance to do today?
Well, I just want to say really quickly, if you haven't read Rena's books, they're amazing. The first book in her Kingdom of Souls trilogy trilogy, right? It's going to be a trilogy. Yes. Here, I have it right here, actually. So Kingdom of Souls by Rena Barron. It's amazing. The last like quarter of that book, my jaw like just hit the floor and it never came back up again. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that she's doing this. This is amazing. Fantastic world building. If you love really like lush, epic fantasies, you should read Rena's books. And then also, just really quickly, this book that I'm reading right now, which is actually an adult book, but it's really, really good. It's called Sharks in the Time of Saviors. And I am loving it. The voice is fantastic. And it's about it's like a family saga that deals with Hawaiian gods. And it's just wonderful. So highly recommend.
I have Rena's book sitting right over there. So that just bumped it up.
You guys are really making me blush.
Well, I mean, I can say that I've read a book by each of the authors, which is a challenge I do for myself every year.
Oh, wow.
And I love them all. So I'm so glad that you guys are appreciating each other's. I mean, I think this really like adds the humanness to authors too. We talked about that in the last panel, that authors used to be this sort of like mythical creature, you know, out there that we never really got to see or hear from. And it's really cool to just have that humanness to the folks who are writing the things that we love to read.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, we love to geek out over each other's books. So when we get together, all we do is really just geek out over each other in the book. So that's the fun part about being an author too.
And we love to see it.
Honestly, when I was on a panel with Claire, I got really excited because Salt Code Girls is absolutely one of my favorite books the year that I read it. And it like still haunts me there are certain moments of that book that I think about on the reg. So
oh my gosh. Thank you. Thank you. That means so much. That book was so fun to write.
I bet. Yeah.
So thank you. I appreciate that.
But this has been a really interesting panel thinking about both unlikely, and I know we sort of merged into unlikable, but it's been a really fascinating discussion.
It has been. It's given me a lot to think about, actually. I haven't examined the word hero quite in that, that level of depth before, and it's interesting.
Yeah. Cool. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. For everyone who's out there, as well as everybody whose face I can see. And I believe that there's no session scheduled during this kind of lunch break. So folks can check out the vendors and check out sponsors and also bio breaks, take care of yourself. And then we'll see folks join back up for panels at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much.